photography took off in a huge way in the 19th century in India.
Right.
And during the colonial empire, the requirements for photography were slightly different. It was more to document the country and its people almost as if we were objects.
Mm-hmm.
And that was primarily the aim of the colonial photographers. And of course, as souvenirs to take back to talk about the land that they ruled and they helped control. And soon enough, Indians joined on the game, and we had a lot of Indian photographers working both privately in the big metropolitan cities and also in the smaller ports across the country. And the transition of photography from then to modern was fairly seamless because by the 1920s and 30s, we had a host of non-British photographers also coming into India. And while people learned photography from these practitioners, they soon started taking their own version of photographs of India. And this continued on to a very healthy practice of having photographers, Indian photographers, post independence, who traveled on with this work. The focus moved away from monuments and objects to people, portraits, the new independence movement, the country, agriculture, the newer structures being built. So that was essentially the focus in genre. More close-ups. You had warmer family groups together.
Mm-hmm.
You had people who sort of were not, in the colonial photography, one of the big things they had was this to do you photograph you by caste and by type and by community.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You didn't see Indian photographers doing that. Uh, Indian photographers didn't go around photographing the great sites of India just for a tourist purpose. If at all they did, they wanted to exclusive studios who did this kind of work because they knew that there were lots of foreigners or colonial officials in India anxious to buy these as souvenirs and take them back. So they did it when it suited their purpose, but largely the work was then focusing on portraits of groups of people within the country for private commissions, where perhaps to celebrate functions, but definitely document a lot of the life at the princely courts across the country. That was a huge market. Every court invariably, by the late 19th century, had an official photographer, and crucially, many states also had a huge painting tradition where the painter's job was to document in minutiae, literally, the everyday affairs of the state. And this role was taken over by the photographer soon enough, and we have major studios coming up where the fathers were the last great painters and the sons became photographers. The importance of color is quite humongous in India, actually. We don't necessarily like anything in black and white, and that's historically been true. We've had a huge tradition of miniature painting, which started with paintings on palm manuscripts, which exist from the 12th, 13th century onwards, and some even earlier. The earlier ones you saw both color and black and white imagery, but soon the color took a huge predominant on, and the miniature tradition was so strong that every region almost had their own individual styles of painting.
Wow.
And definitely color was introduced in that. But when photography initially started in the 1840s, just you must keep this in mind that in 1839, when photography was invented or announced to the world in Europe, within the 1 year, you had the first studios opening up in India.
Mm-hmm.
So by 1840 in Calcutta, we had the first studios doing it. And daguerreotype, which really took off, didn't really allow for too much color in the initial years, but soon you could even introduce color into daguerreotype.
Mm-hmm.
And post that, artists in India who did realize that their tradition as miniature painters was slowly going out of fashion, either took to photography or took to painting and tinting over black and white photographs with different shades of color. And that became a huge business. In fact, painted photographs are something that we come across all the time in many of the Princely Palace collections that we're working on. So color photography was very important. The moment the court realized, or the people realized, that you could have photography which was an accurate depiction of a person or a place, but then you can add color to it and make it almost real and lifelike, and choose the palette that you like. It was for sure a very interesting thing. And in India, like I said before, color was everything. So it definitely was better than having a black and white image. The one interesting trend is that in the 1840s, when you see the ruler in splendid isolation being photographed, by the 1930s and 40s, when India was being formed as an independent country, you saw the ruler surrounded with a horde of people around him. So the camera, as against seeing him in isolation, started seeing him with the people, and you saw how the ruler blended in slightly better than earlier. And this is something we see across the different courts and archives that we work in the country. influence is definitely the modes of portraying people, because local photographers came from an aesthetic of miniatures and culture. They definitely went forward and photographed in this new style, which is an amalgamation of the colonial encounter, of the tradition, of theater, like I mentioned earlier. And this evolution of photography today in the country is clearly a result of a coming together of so many different practices. And that is uniquely important to be studied and understood, so that we understand where we started this style of work from. So, in the larger history of photography, the use of getting the camera into spaces where they would traditionally not have been allowed, and the fact that they allowed us to document the country so beautifully is lastly the most important thing, because we would have no track of several historic places, several historic people with the kind of precision of photography had it not existed. Not being a homogeneous whole is very endemic to this part of South Asia as well, is that everybody is different and they have different languages, different dialects, different forms of eating food, different religions. So that variation continues when you look at photography.